Hello and welcome. Very excited to be launching our new publication combinations today. So thanks for everyone who could join us. My name is Matt Prewitt, and what we're here to do today is to introduce our new publication and have a brief conversation between the editors and two of the contributors. Um, I also want to give a big thanks to Project Liberty for supporting Radical Exchange and supporting this work. We're really, really proud of what we've put together here and excited about the future of the project. But all of the credit goes to the contributors and also, but sort of first and foremost, to Paula Berman and Guy Mackinnon-Little, the editors, who've done an amazing job. So, without further ado, I will turn it over to them. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt, and hi, everyone. And to get started, I want to take a moment to thank all of the incredible authors, editors, designers, web developers who have worked with great care and dedication to make this new publication a reality, and of course to Guy, who is here with us and who co-edited this inaugural issue with me and really helped conceive this project from beginning to end. And Guy will give us an overview of this first issue in a moment. But before I hand it over to Guy, I want to say a few words about what has driven us at Radical Exchange to create this new publication. And this started with us by seeing two pressing needs in today's narrative landscape that we thought we were in a good position to help address. So on the one hand, we wanted to create a platform where we could critically examine how technology is reconfiguring power and reconfiguring our institutions. And then on the other hand, we also wanted to take a look at new institutional improvements and social technologies that can point toward compelling futures for technologically mature societies. And our particular focus here is on improvements that are in service of community, agency, and collective action. And to do these two things, we are planning to feature two types of content. So the first is think pieces, and these are going to be coming out once a month. And with each think piece, we're also going to be publishing a podcast where Matt, who is the host of the Radical Exchange podcast, will interview the author of the essay. And then with a less fixed cadence, we are also going to be publishing short case studies of what we call real world experiments. So these are experiments with new institutions or social technologies like voting systems, community currencies, public goods funding systems, ways of doing deliberation online, digital democracy, licensing models, and anything in between. And we at Radical Exchange facilitate those sometimes, and we are in touch with different groups who are doing this as well. So we want to reflect that ferment of experimentation to make it more legible to the world. And so we are going to be writing this with a less regular cadence, but this is also something that we would really like to cover. So if you have a pitch for us, please reach out to us at combinations@radicalexchange.org. And then the last thing I'll say before handing it over to Guy is that we are about to start our conversation, and then we'll reserve a few minutes at the end to take in questions from you. So if you're watching us on X, you can just reply to our live stream post with your question. And then on YouTube or Twitch, you can use the comments on the chat. So this is it. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us. And Guy, I'll hand it over to you now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paula. So I'm going to say a bit about the specific content and direction of the inaugural issue of Combinations, which kind of forms the occasion for our conversation today. So the issue is organized around the theme of myth and mechanism. And it uses this lens to explore the interplay between the grand narratives that have guided humanity, so things like our theologies, historical legacies, and collective myths, and the concrete institutions and technologies that perpetuate them. We are interested in exploring this theme because I think we're interested in doing away with the false distinction within it. Pragmatism and speculation are often pitted against each other, but the challenges we face today demand that we can both imagine and implement new ways of organizing the world. With this publication, we hope to demonstrate something of what that might look like. So to that end, the issue contains both, as Paula was saying, exploratory essays and spotlights of concrete experiments in institutional reconfiguration. In addition to the contributions by our two guests today, which you'll hear plenty about in due course, we have Jaya Clara Bracker on contemporary identity systems in the industry of the self, Guy Zhang on the history of cybernetics in China, J.H. Weiler on how democracies can balance individual rights and collective religious expression, Diva Siddharth, Glenn Vale, and Anne-Marie Slaughter on the shortcomings of the network state, and our own Matt Prewitt and Jack Henderson on an alternative paradigm to UBI they term post-cognitive income. And what I think is apparent just from that sneak peek, as much as it's a sort of cursory overview, is the plurality of perspectives, subject matter, and ideological convictions contained here, and the way that they're nevertheless held together by a shared commitment to the methodology I was describing earlier, which I would say is one of grounded speculation and an eagerness to experiment with present societal arrangements. And I think with this publication, that methodology, that approach to remaking the world rather than any single narrative or perspective or proclamation about what is urgently needed now is what we're hoping to cultivate, and hopefully we can cultivate some of that in our conversation today. So with that, I'll hand back over to Paula, who will be giving a brief introduction and starting the conversation.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Guy. And let's move now into our conversation. And first off, thank you, Christina and Rana. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you here. And to get us started, I'd like to ask each of you to introduce yourselves, tell us what your background is, and then share in a few sentences what your piece is about. Christina, we may start with you.
Cool. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I'm really excited and grateful to be able to contribute to the first issue of Combinations. So I am an AI researcher and occasionally an artist, currently pursuing a PhD in Oxford's Human-Centered AI group. I was formerly a software engineer at Google DeepMind and also have spent time at think tanks and supported by RadicalxChange to develop a speculative project called Whole Earth Codec, which is about an ecological foundation model. So the piece that I wrote for the Combinations was kind of addressing this movement in AI alignment that is currently going on, called pluralistic alignment. And so alignment in general is trying to make sure that the AI models we create have the same goals as humans. And pluralistic alignment seeks to kind of take into account the fact that, humans have contradicting values. And so I'm sort of making the argument that a lot of the incentives acting upon the wider ecosystem of AI models actually create machine learning models of homogeneous ontologies and worldviews that underline values. And so if we actually want to have a more expansive idea of pluralism in AI, we need to start thinking about multiplicity that is actually embedded into the architecture and emergent. Thank you.
Hi there. I'm also very grateful to be in conversation with you all and finally to meet some of the people that I've had such stimulating exchanges with over the last few months. My name is Rana Dasgupta. I'm a writer of many kinds. And after writing a series of books, especially novels, I came up against, all my work was coming up against a particular problem, which was that of the nation state. And I spent the last many years researching and writing a book that's now about to come out called After Nations. So I approached the problems of this conversation not so much through the lens of what is sort of possible, but through the lens of what a malfunctioning system we've inherited, a system of political arrangements that is malfunctioning in the current era, and that forces us to seek alternative ways of solving problems and managing and creating human political capacities. So in this conversation, Christina might be the future person and I might be the past person, because my impulse is very much to understand how we got to the point we're at today, often over very long historical cycles. In the case of ecology, multi-thousand years historical cycles, in order to formulate the present as a multivalent crisis. And so my impulse towards the future comes really from that. So I hope we can have an exchange that balances all these different perspectives.
We'll surely have that. Thank you both. Our audience hasn't read your essays yet. Our website just went live about half an hour ago. So I want to take a moment to dive into each of your essays by asking particular questions to each of you. And then we'll start putting our ideas in conversation with each other, because there are many interesting intersections there. So Christina, my first question is for you. And in your essay, you're expressing this concern with the homogeneity of the current AI landscape. And you say that this is in part because of this scaling hypothesis and this imperative of fitting similar models with ever-increasing quantities of data, which will yield proportional improvements in the performance of these models. But you make critiques to this model and to this homogeneity, and you argue that it can be precarious and even dangerous in a variety of ways. So my question for you is, what would an alternative paradigm look like? And what are some of the indicators coming out in current AI research that it's actually possible to develop AI under very different data requirements? And then I think it would be great also if you shared a bit more about the Whole Earth Codec, which we're very proud to support at RadicalxChange, and which is a project where you're experimenting with instantiating some of these ideas that you're arguing for.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, sort of the status quo that we have now in machine learning is we have basically all of the big publicly available models released by companies are sort of converging on really similar things. So they have similar architectures, they are built using very similar data sets. And in my piece, I kind of take us through a lot of the different incentives that have created this current situation. So as you mentioned, one big reason is that first of all, it costs a lot to train a massive AI model like GPT-4. And the companies they want basically a guaranteed or like low risk return on investment. And one way of doing that is basically through scaling data and compute, and not necessarily doing a ton of experimental research on the architecture of the model. And so you basically have companies throwing more and more data at models, more compute. And all the data basically comes from the same source, which is the internet. So everyone is scraping the internet. And so you kind of end up with models that really converge on similar behavior and become this, I want to say, like huge flattening of compression of the entire internet into a model. So even when you have this appearance of choice from all these different providers, they're actually quite similar in behavior. And so to me, this is quite problematic, because when more and more people start to use these models for their everyday cognitive tasks, they're basically engaging with an averaging of information that, oftentimes may give you a correct answer, but I worry sort of flattens the way that we're thinking and hardens the ontologies with which we think with. And so my sort of, ideal future vision for an alternative paradigm would be basically kind of shifting the idea of having huge general foundational models towards a vision that might be a bit more modular and compositional. So, rather than having massive generalized models, we have sort of bespoke models that are assembled or put together from different components per use case. So basically, approaching with the more, I guess, like sort of kit bashing way of putting models together. And I think, briefly on the Whole Earth Codec, which is a more is also like kind of like the speculative proposal that I've been working on for a technology that I think should exist, is specifically on this one is, I think, thinking about how, again, most of the large generative models we have are really turned inward and focused on human culture. So they're either trained on mass tracts of like human language or human images that exist on the internet. And actually, there's tons and tons of data that we have available about our planet and about non-humans from the vast types of sensors that we have. And so it might be a lot more interesting to create a foundation model that sort of integrates all of these different streams of non-human data about ecological systems, about the planet, and that could perhaps, reveal more, give us like a technological apparatus to reveal more patterns about the planet. And basically through utilizing the power of a foundation model, have a better way of sensing the ecosystems around us.
Thank you. And this is super fascinating. We are really interested in the Whole Earth Codec and can't wait to see it further develop. But I'll get back to my question for a moment because I'm curious to know what are some of the indicators right now in AI research that these new ways of developing models that are more bespoke, that develop less data, what are some of the indicators that they can also generate good improvements in performance?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the hottest topics right now in training models is sort of in the idea of like federated learning and different ways of basically, training models without having access to the data, which is sort of guaranteed via all these like cryptographic methods. And I think that feels quite promising. And this isn't really specific to like using less data, but it is about sort of having more, I guess, like architectural pluralistic models. Is that I think there's more and more demonstrations of, being able to sort of compose models from like smaller ones, and that basically allows you to sort of create like learn new distributions of data much quicker than like fully retraining on everything. So basically, by like, let's say you have a new corpus of training data, you can train a much smaller model on that distribution and sort of combine it with maybe a previous larger model, which allows you to extrapolate to new data distributions much easier. So yeah, I think there are more techniques that seem to imply this more modular paradigm to putting models together.
Thank you. This is really fascinating, and I hope that you all can read Christina's piece, which is called Model Plurality, and it's right now up on the combinationsmag.com website. And with that, I'll hand it over to Matt, who has a question for you, Rana.
Thanks. So Rana, first of all, I really loved your piece. Thanks for writing it and contributing. And my question is that you are, broadly speaking, arguing for a sort of rediscovery of theology, if I understand correctly, but in a way that nonetheless incorporates some of the key values of liberalism. And I wonder if you could say a few words about, first of all, the challenges of that, and second, what it might look like to imagine a sort of a theological perspective on the politics that you have in mind.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I'm not really arguing to sort of bring theology back where it doesn't belong, but rather to recognize that the reality that we are in is highly theological. So, if we think about it, we often think about the world today as a system of flows, as very flexible and liquid kinds of energies. But theology has actually proved to be rather rigid. And you can see that, if you think of Europe as Christendom, it still kind of is. And the issue of faith, the issue of foreign faith to the continent and stuff like that is becoming a really big political issue in many countries. The issue of whether Turkey, for instance, can be part of the EU, these are all questions that sort of disrupt the historical lines of religion around that continent. And it's the same in many other countries and regions too. So my argument is based on the fact that liberalism is not a kind of departure from religion, but rather an internal reformation within Christianity, which then was generalized to the rest of the world. And if we see liberalism failing today, if we see illiberal politics gaining ground against it, and if we see, if you read, France in the 16th century and 17th century, the religious wars of France, it's very easy to see that we're in a very similar situation of people who on two sides of a religious divide who regard the other as absolutely sacrilegious. And have failed to have any empathy across that divide, because essentially it is pretty much a religious issue of whether you belong in this camp or you belong in that camp. So when I call for a kind of a theological examination of these things, I'm calling essentially for a kind of deep analysis of these structures that we've inherited. How did nationalism become such a religious force in the world? How did we absorb the attributes of the Christian God into the state apparatus, such that Western populations particularly expected to have a very sacred kind of covenant with the state? And when the state reneged on that covenant or started to withdraw services, it was experienced as a theological kind of breakdown, to the extent that, to me, liberalism today in the West and in many other places, and I'm currently speaking from India, where it's also true, but to some extent, liberalism is experienced as the faith of a corrupt elite who have propagated liberal pieties of equality and all these sorts of things, essentially to promote their own ethos of mobile capital. And so all kinds of illiberal sects and blasphemies and heresies are kind of erupting everywhere. And that's something we see in national politics all over the world. And that is the sort of theological study I'm calling for. It is really for liberals and and essentially political science, which has accepted wholesale the kind of religion of the state, liberalism, as an unquestionable kind of system, to step back and see the theological origins of this, the theological content of this, and why it is that to many people who feel dispossessed by current politics, that they feel that their battle also is a religious battle. I think if we kind of pose it in that way, we can understand better what today I feel is, though it is absolutely forefront in our political world, it's not actually that well understood.
So it's such a rich topic, but one of the things that comes to mind for me is that if you take the idea of sort of liberalism as a phenomenon within Christendom, for example, I think that there has always been sort of a tradition within circles of theological thinkers, let's say, that sort of look at liberalism as as a heresy, basically, as sort of like a wrong turn for theology within their tradition. And one of the things that occurs to me is that if we look at, I mean, first of all, do you agree with that? So by looking at liberalism through this theological lens, are we in a sense saying that that some of these sort of religious or theological critics of liberalism have had a point all along? And second, does this require sort of a new kind of synthetic sort of theological thinking in order to recover in order to save some of the core values of liberalism? So, you know, in your piece, you argue that some of these core things, like, you know, liberté, égalité, fraternité, should be need to be preserved. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about sort of how to do that from a theological point of view.
Yeah, I mean, these are huge conversations, and I wish we could break it down and have many days of this. So I think, first of all, I think that a lot of the people who devised liberalism, we can think of Hobbes, we can think of Rousseau, we can think of Locke. So many of these people, Baudin in France, so many of these people were essentially theologians. They were starting from biblical texts, and they were trying to spin those texts in new ways. So it's not, again, I wouldn't put liberalism on one side and theology on another. I think this is critical because, let us take, for instance, one of the instructions of Christ. You know, Christ is saying, those people who are untouchable, who are unclean, tax collectors, prostitutes, people of certain ethnic minorities, people with certain kind of diseases, these people are not unclean. They all belong in a universal kingdom of heaven. Now, liberalism takes that and transposes it onto the nation state. That there are certain things that you can't argue with in the liberal state. Equality is just an imperative. That's one of the things that you can't start to fit to. These are the things that you can't change in liberalism. But obviously, for many religions, untouchability is extremely important. Many religions don't interface well with this idea because one of their core principles is the pure and impure. And so, you know, when liberalism was sort of imposed on a lot of colonies, a lot of these things, politics of sex, politics of inter-religious and inter-race relations, politics of commerce, even, which brings people together from all kinds of backgrounds, politics of technology and public space. These liberal laws that did away with all the laws that separated people and designated different zones for different activities was felt to be a great assault on pre-existing cultures. So, I don't know who you're referring to when you talk about these theologians, but one of the theologians I referred to in the text is Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian theologian who comes out of the initial Muslim Brotherhood organization essentially to develop an extremely puritanical and militant response to the imposition of French and British liberal culture, which had also produced an Egyptian liberal elite, which he found to be extremely dangerous for the religion and culture he was representing. So, the values that have come up in response to liberalism are often extremely alarming in their treatment of women, in their treatment of all kinds of things. I mean, they are framed as a sort of military assault on everything that exists. So we don't want to be, it's a dead end. We don't want to be drawn in that direction. But I think we have to take seriously the questions that are raised by those kind of people. And, to lead on to maybe the rest of this discussion, because I could speak endlessly on all these questions, but obviously what liberalism has done, and communism too, which was a sibling, but we don't talk about communism that much, but both of these eventually became religions of the state. And so you had lots of people fighting theologically over the apparatus of the state, and the internal national battle was itself a kind of sacred cause. But all of this is a giant distraction if planetary politics is your objective. You are getting caught into sort of spirals of internecine kind of theological battles over, does the state stand for abortion, for instance? I mean, it's quite interesting the extent to which that metaphysical question of the status of the unborn child lies at the center of so many national debates when we think we're past religion. But actually, metaphysics is dividing people a lot. But of course, my call in the piece is for us to get away from identifying the state with God at all, because we can see a lot of countries right now are essentially treating their national military campaigns as sacred campaigns. And in a global world where we are all, essentially dependent on the same kind of economic, technological processes, this sort of 18th century theology of the state is it doesn't help us in any way. We have to rethink. But rethinking is not a 5-minute job. It's not that you just come up with an idea and sell it. The Enlightenment was itself a kind of 100-year process of redesigning Christianity, and many of the people who did it were exiled, imprisoned, etc., for their writings. Once again, we are going to be operating in the realm of the very bizarre, and we'll have many failed experiments and weird theological partners involved when we start something like this.
Do you think that, let's say, advocates of something like the traditional values of the Enlightenment should understand themselves as doing theology? Because what strikes me as sort of interesting is that, most defenders of those values over the past, let's say at least 100 years maybe, have and perhaps longer, have saw what they're doing as in a different genre, have understood their advocacy of their values as somehow not theology. And I wonder if you think that is I mean, it's possible that from the internal perspective of any theology, people sort of think it's not theology. People just think, well, you know, in a way, I've got the truth, and these other people have myths. And so there's just something interesting in that, about sort of switching the self-understanding of advocates of liberal values to a theological understanding. And my question is whether you think that is a first step in this rethinking, or not exactly.
Yeah, to a great extent. I mean, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if you read the deliberations of the Catholic Church about, you know, the conquests in Latin America in the 16th century, they didn't think that they were sort of in some kind of battle of religions. They were just extending the true faith. So it wasn't, they didn't have any sort of self-doubt on this front. And to a great extent, liberalism and communism, I mean, but now we're really, liberalism is the issue, have proceeded in the same kind of way. And the 1990s, of course, was this sort of euphoric moment for liberalism when its fundamental truth was demonstrated. And I think that the fact that it might be rather nasty people, for instance, Putin, who decry the West's claim to representing universal values, doesn't mean that a lot of other people might not feel the same kind of thing. I mean, I said again, I'm speaking to you from India, which is another country which has had a lot of problems with the way that the West has presented these values as universal. And some of those critiques are legitimate, and some of those are self-servingly illegitimate. But I think the way that the Trump election has been processed by liberals, to me, demonstrates a certain lack of introspection about how those liberals appear to people who don't belong to their camp, and indeed to the kind of appeal that may be made to the people who are kind of dropping out of the American story on other terms. You know, it's quite clear that a lot of people in the world are very receptive to illiberal promises, illiberal in the sense that they might benefit one ethnic or gender group over another, blah blah blah. But for a lot of people in the world, they're looking for those kinds of reassurances. We I think need to go back to the drawing board to understand how this universality might be constructed, because clearly liberalism is not that, not in its current form. Even though, as you say, and I'll shut up, I think that the fundamental promises that Enlightenment philosophers came down to, and that many of these states, you know, France and America are the two that have embattled most significantly with illiberal forces. They came down to certain promises of what the state could do, or what what politics in general was for, which I think are precious and should be held on to.
That's great. Thanks. Paula.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question now for the two of you. Hopefully this gave our audience a glimpse of some of the ideas that you're discussing in each of your pieces, and now I want to start putting them into conversation with each other. And one common theme that I see there is that both of your essays are expressing similar concerns about the stasis of thought. But you're doing that, of course, from different vantage points. Christina's piece is about technology, and it refers to ontological stasis in machine learning models that tend to crystallize the past as represented by the data sets that they were developed with. And Rana, your piece is more oriented towards politics and discusses the stasis of liberal thinking. So I'm curious to know from both of you, Rana, what role does technology play in your vision? And then from you, Christina, what role does politics play in the vision that you articulate in your piece? And Christina, we can start with you.
Cool. Yeah, I'll do my best, because I think a lot more about how technology changes politics than how politics changes technology. But I think the main thing for me is how like political conceptions of sovereignty, whether that's self-sovereignty or from where sovereignty is derived, I think is going to really impact sort of the future landscape of AI models. I think right now we're sort of running up against a time where, you know, data has, where like your sovereignty over your own data is becoming really relevant in most discussions around AI policy. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think this might be controversial, but I think I don't see a lot. I find that a lot of this sort of over indexes on the individual when it comes to data, and there's less thinking around data as something that is collectively generated and collectively made useful. And so I think that sort of, I think figuring out, you know, what is this, from where sovereignty is being derived right now? Is it from the data or is it from the individual? Is something that we need to figure out. And then I think another thing that I quite liked in Rana's piece actually was, and that I think I'm quite aligned with, is this idea of, you know, we sort of need to sort of like not retire, but relax a little bit on focusing on the nation state as the unit of sort of, you know, governance, and think of things in more planetary terms. So I think, yeah, I feel like most of our technological infrastructure is already reshaping and modifying the bounds of governance, and they're not perfectly aligned to nation state borders at this point. And I think that, to me, a model of planetary governance that, and also not just via like political institutions, but also thinking more about governance that comes from mechanisms, is, yeah, I think without that, I don't see a lot of my speculative futures for AI possible.
Thank you. Rana, on to you.
Yeah, there's a lot to say here. I hope we can sort of chat later in this conversation. It's very interesting hearing you speak, Christina. I mean, I think to me, these things are just massively, massively interconnected. The nation state itself is a technological machine, and it defeated other political formations because it was technologically superior, not only in military terms, but also in terms of internal propaganda, media, and information systems, its ability to coerce its own population, and very importantly, industry, which gave an entire purpose to the nation state. It gave labor, it gave a class system, it gave a huge kind of profit system. So the nation state, in its sort of, and I date it back to not earlier than the 18th century, emerges as a technological formation as well as everything else. And one of the things that's happened today is that the nation state is competing with technologically superior entities, and it doesn't function very well when it's outclassed technologically. And I think that just there are two, I think, very, very sort of important examples we can just give here briefly, which intersect with what Christina is saying. I think one is that the very big industrial technology firms of the post-Second World War era, you can think of General Motors, they sat very neatly within the nation state. They amplified the powers of the nation state through taxation, through whatever, all kinds of processes. Big tech today does not sit neatly within the nation state in any way. And as we know, a lot of the Silicon Valley companies have been desperately trying to evade all the powers of the nation state, not only taxation, but also regulation. And you know, when I first wrote about this 5 years ago, I never expected that a guy like Elon Musk would be playing the kind of role that he is today. But it's fully to be expected, I think, because I liken the Silicon Valley firms to the East India Company, which was something that almost brought down the British state in the 18th century. These companies will not have a high tolerance over the long term of democracy in its current form. They will wish to infiltrate and repurpose democracy in a way that allows some of the very, very substantial social and especially labor changes they are implementing not to result in political breakdown. And I think the other thing that's interesting to mention, and this connects to what Christina was just saying, is that the leading states of the world for sort of 4 or 5 centuries tore up the entire planet in an attempt to impose legal systems on everywhere else. Legal systems that were designed essentially to guarantee the security of capital wherever they would invest, build, mine, whatever it might be. That the idea that you need to kind of control government in order to control systems of information, law, etc., may now be breaking down. There may be technological alternatives which make many of this national power redundant. If we can secure property, human rights, even all kinds of legal truths through, say, blockchains, through technological systems, this might compete with the nation state. So I think that when our political structure has more advanced technological competitors, it starts to fall back on its crudest functions. It can't compete technologically, financially, etc. So it falls back on its ability to enforce the law, to control its borders, and it starts to present a kind of hysterical parody of politics, because there is no politics anymore. The state is not controlling very much, so it performs politics, and that's part of the, I think, crazy anxiety that we see around us in sort of electoral politics today, if that makes sense.
I think that's super interesting. I have a question, but before I do, I think I kind of want to lead into a bit and say how I think what you're just saying, Rana, is super fascinating, because it, again, I think points to the kind of overlap between your line of inquiry and Christina's, where in describing empire and the imposition, not just of like a sort of belief system, but a very specific kind of infrastructural mode of organization that's maybe less distinct from the kind of formal institutions of politics as we recognize them, there seems to be a sort of clear analogy between the homogenizing vector of these contemporary technologies that Christina is describing, that are, again, operating at this global scale. And I think that question of scale kind of pulls us back to this question of the planetary, whereby this is a word that has kind of taken up a lot of traction in recent years. It's a kind of successor concept to globalization in a way, that sort of tries to move past the conversations that characterize that era of oppositions between the local and the global, and sort of tries to think about our collective fate as a planetary unit, whatever that might mean. But I think like any kind of political floating signifier that acquires that momentum, it kind of means as many things as there are people investigating the concept. So I think it would be great. You've of course both touched on it in brief already, but to hear each of you dive into your sort of specific understanding of the planetary, and also what futures it points us towards. So if a lot of the conversation has been about the sort of inertia of the systems we've inherited and the danger of thinking about things in quick succession, you know, as you're saying, Rana, like it's not as if tech replaces the state, tech kind of moves into the state and makes it something else. So I'm curious about how the planetary can steer us towards something new in that capacity. So what is the planetary and what does it steer us towards? Maybe Christina, if you want to go first.
Sure. Yeah, I think about the planetary a lot. And to me, it's sort of about the idea of like expanding, you know, not who we consider as like moral patients, but I think expanding who we consider as cognitive or like as cognizers to both technological and non-technological systems and non-humans. So that is, yeah, includes literally animals, but also, you know, the various abiotic sort of silicone-based intelligence that we have. Yeah, and I think sort of integrating or like maybe focusing less on, you know, planetary as like, okay, this is all the humans on the planet, but rather sort of viewing human intelligence as sort of co-evolutionary with both the technologies that we have and with the non-human systems and the ecologies around us. And for me, I think the allure of and the promise of a lot of the technological infrastructure that we have is that it might enable a more robust sensing and acting apparatus that allows us to plug into planetary ecologies. And yeah, I think part of the planetary is about recognizing these alternative forms of cognition. And when I say cognition, I mean it as basically, you know, anything that is able to interpret information within context, give it meaning, and then act or make a choice. Not in a free will sense, but more in like a information processing sense. So I think that would expand the idea of the cognizers that shape the planet beyond just humans. And I think it also allows us like a better lens to that, again, focuses less on individuals, but more on what theorist Catherine Hale calls like a cognitive assemblage. So I think when we're sort of dealing with, you know, more and more like combinations of humans and technology, whether that's like the combination of a soldier and a drone or the combination of, you know, a self-driving car, I think when we have an idea of planetary that sort of thinks of things in terms of like cognitive assemblages and cognitive systems that make decisions together, you know, like like a soldier and a drone is not just soldier and a drone, it's also like the military systems and the technological systems that have sort of marshaled them to this point. I think to me that is what the planetary is about. Yeah, it's about cognition, and it's about sort of understanding the co-evolution and co-development of both human, non-human technological, biological systems.
That's great. Thank you, Rana. To you.
Yeah, I think, I mean, Christina and I come together a lot on those concepts. I think that, you know, to take the theological, I mean, the Judeo-Christian system implies human domination of other species. And I think the planetary, I mean, one obvious signification of the planetary is to think about the interconnections of all natural systems and non-natural systems. But I think for me, what we describe as globalization is to some extent a kind of commercial appropriation of the nation state system in order to monetize high gradients, economic gradients between territories. So you put your elite workers and your intellectual property in states where there is an extremely dense system of legal protections, blah, blah, blah. You put other activities into territories where there are almost no legal protections at all, your mining operations or your logging operations or whatever. And in this way, gradually, poverty, war, ecological devastation are concentrated in some zones of the world, and the positive surplus of the global system is concentrated in other zones of the world. And you have essentially reinforced or exacerbated the difference in legal and economic experience between those at the top and the bottom of the system by entrenching it and making money from it, and requiring poor countries essentially to serve up poor cheap labor, serve up cheap forests, cheap land, all that sort of thing. This is clearly unjust. The only way that a lot of people can ever expect to claim rights and a decent life in the system is to migrate illegally, because obviously globalization is also preceded by allowing elites to move and everybody else not to. So if we have the nation state system nested inside a system of globalization that is basically monetizing inequality, the planetary would come in as a counter ethos. And I think of that in two ways. One is that the planetary would have a sort of, and I see it as a kind of open-ended and idealistic project. So, you know, many different voices would contribute to it. But at its sort of broadest objective, I would see that it would seek to restore at the global those political resources that are being eroded at the national. That it would secure us against the various forms of treachery of the nation state, and try and make good the stark failures of nation states to ever deliver things like the human rights that were expected of this system back in the 1940s. So those would be kind of political projects, but in terms of sort of strategy and process, I think that the planetary would be like a sort of mold growing within the system. It would be a kind of, it would not proceed in the terms of the current terms of political life. In other words, we're not simply going to scale up the nation state to the scale of the globe and keep everything else essentially as it was. The planetary would proceed in a sort of horizontal, creeping and technologically advanced way, in a way that many nation states might not even notice. I mean, Facebook didn't go and conquer 3 billion users. It didn't fight a war with nation states to gain those people. It just entered those spaces and supplied needs that were not currently supplied. I think that even the nation state itself grew up as an infiltration of previous systems in the same kind of way. You know, feudal aristocratic systems turned out to be less rational, more corrupt, and less able to service a rising merchant class than kings did. Kings could offer certain kinds of goods to a sort of the late medieval mercantile class that feudal lords couldn't. And so basically the nation state started to sap energy from feudal dukedoms, etc. I see the moment we're in as a similar thing in which new systems, new kinds of citizenship, new kinds of currency, new kinds of political deliberation might simply outflank nation states, might start to acquire users in the way that, you know, big data companies have acquired users, simply because they supply needs that are not supplied today, but needs that are much deeper than the social needs supplied by Facebook, needs that are absolutely existential, needs of my ability to feed my family, needs of my ability to protect myself legally from all kinds of threats, needs to preserve my identity as I leave my country and migrate to places where the climate is bearable, where I can cultivate the land, all these sorts of things. These needs are needs that for 1 billion or more people, and probably more as the decades wear on, are critical. And it's not clear that nation states can supply all those things. I mean, to give only the example, I mean, I think Christina would talk better than me about what AI can do better than, let's say, traditional democracy in harvesting ideas for how society should be run. I don't think that democracy, with its incredible waste and incredible corruption, is a particularly good way of harvesting the best ideas from a population about what should happen in its future. But just to give one example here, which we haven't really touched on, is currency. I think that nationally administered currencies are very, very scarce in many countries. There are lots of populations that are poor simply because they cannot access the currencies issued by their governments, but they're not actually poor in any other sense. They're surrounded by resources. They have youthful populations. They know how to work and trade and all that sort of thing, but they don't have a liquidity. It's possible community currencies can today, I think, operate at internet scale because there are new ways of generalizing trust and all these sorts of things. So these are things that nation states will push back against, because nation states are monopolies. They're built on a series of monopolies of violence, issuing of laws, issuing of currencies, and they're not going to enjoy those monopolies being taken away. We've already seen it with sort of battles with big tech. We've seen it with battles over taxation. We've seen it with battles with crypto. So we know that these are things that nation states are going to push back against. But I suspect that nation states are also going to be dealing with problems in the coming years for instance, human migration. You know, migration is already at a scale where European countries are kind of buckling, and it's very, very low compared to what it will be in the future. So even nation states, I suspect, might wish to hand over some functions to, let's call them, planetary systems that are better shaped that share a shape with the problem, if you see what I mean, which nation states don't. So that's my sense of the planetary. It is a kind of gradual infiltration of a nationalized system that we have today. Most people view, because we are all part of the religion of nation states, and we've all been educated by nation states, and we're trained to fear their sort of decline. We imagine that these kinds of transfers of energies from the state to other forces is going to be catastrophic and scary. and I'm sure it will be in many respects. But I think that given the rapid decline of our political capacities and their diminishing power compared to the scale of the problems we now face, I think it would be wise for us to insulate ourselves against the collapse of nation states by building ethical and purposeful systems rather than just allow things to collapse of their own without such safety nets and just enter a long dark age, which is the alternative.
I wonder if I could ask a quick follow-up to that. So one, you raised sort of an interesting question about the role of nation states in a transition to the planetary. And I struggle with this myself. I see a sort of an interesting duality here in the role that nation states can play. So on the one hand, I agree that, for example, things like alternative currencies or other sorts of creative methods of creating liquidity where there's not enough. These are important ideas that I'm very interested in, and which seem to require the nation state to sort of step back a little bit to allow that kind of problem to be solved in other ways. In other words, to let go of their monopoly. But then there are other, equally important, perhaps, areas in which it's hard for me to imagine what, besides the nation state, could protect people from exploitation by very powerful forces. And one of the principal examples of that, in my mind, is data. So, for example, the data is inherently hard to control, right? And when we, going back to some of the ideas that Christina was talking to, if we think of data as this collectively produced thing, with that collectively produced thing is sort of, can be fed into, for example, large AI systems that enormously empower their possessors. And I have trouble thinking of a powerful entity other than nation states that could prevent or that could sort of limit the ability of for example, the largest technology companies to exploit the enormous latent power in the data that is collectively produced. So I see this confusing duality. I don't have it sorted out, and I wonder if you, if either of you have thoughts about sort of about that.
Yeah, I mean, I do have some thoughts on this. I think that, yeah, you already see this running up with, data laws like GDPR and many of the sort of nascent bubbling conversations around AI and IP, like how, for example, ChatGPT is maybe banned from Italy, or the fact that I think when Google was trying to train their first video generation model, they wanted to train it off of YouTube data, which is all public, but I think they couldn't, or had to be careful around training it on data from people, citizens or accounts in the European Union. And so I think I'm sure Rana can speak more about like what institutions or forms of politics might be required to, I guess, keep the companies in check. But I think I can speak a little bit more about like the maybe cultural, technological impacts, which is that yes, you have one thing, which is maybe, you know, companies are barred from using the data of certain citizens in their models, but then you may also be creating, for example, you know, in a future where most people go to something like ChatGPT or Claude for all of their information research or information gathering requirements, is these models might end up with like massive cultural blind spots and massive sort of gaps in their understanding of, you know, for maybe like an entire continent of people. And so I think, I'm not saying this is like, therefore we should train it on everyone, but I'm saying like there are all these like sort of complicated impacts of this data, like the question of data and sovereignty. Yeah.
Yeah, I think obviously, I mean, you can see from China's very nervous relationship to generative AI that these are questions of sovereignty. These are questions of how a state is going to share power or give space to an incommensurable form of power, which is ultimately also political power, not just financial power. I mean, states like the US and Britain have been traditionally quite comfortable with accommodating vast pools of private wealth. And sometimes that has risked the state because those pools of private wealth are commensurate with the state. China has not been so comfortable across its long history with merchants and private wealth on that scale. And what it's doing today to a lot of tech companies is quite traditional in that respect, because these are questions of statehood. They are questions of state. I don't want to imply in anything that I've said that I think that we need to be destroying things. I mean, I'm not saying that we need to sort of destroy nation states, which anyway we're not equipped to do. What nation states do well, they should continue to do. If we are talking about building supplementary, complementary systems to supply needs that are not currently supplied, that's a very different thing from saying that we should do away with nation states. Nation states in most parts of the world have acquired a reality. They're not fictional entities anymore. Whatever they were when they began, and they were often imposed in an entirely arbitrary way on populations. But today they are real, and most people would be quite dismayed if their nation state was to suddenly disappear. So we're not talking about destruction. We're actually talking about preservation of life in a grander sense that the nation state is capable of. I think so. In terms of a lot of these battles that will always go on between how nation states share power with big tech and with these forms of power that they did not have to deal with until very recently. There's absolutely no precedent in the long history of states for what they are dealing with today in terms of scale. Those battles will go on. I would just say, and here Christina is the expert, not me, but I would just say that I'm skeptical that nation states can take the bits they like from these companies on these technologies and resist the bits they don't like. I think that, if you look at the way that, for instance, Google lawyers have protected the whole thing, and lots of things that are not even actualized yet in the Google system, just because they realize that the continued expansion of their system is going to depend on them having absolute freedom on all fronts. I don't think that it's going to be easy for nation states to say, no, you can do this and you can't do that. Of course, they've tried and they will continue to try, but I think, even if they were to partially succeed in a lot of these battles, I think the levels of social transformation are so enormous that the state will whatever it desires will not come out looking the same. And I think just one example of that is the most obvious, and that is that the nation state during its, let's call it the high period, let's say the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, a period to which most Western states look back with some level of nostalgia, not because it was a stable and static period where there was no conflict. In fact, there was enormous conflict during that period. I think they look back to it with nostalgia because statesmen at that point had authentic power over their territories, because there was a system of national capitalisms that meant that governments actually, in reality, controlled the inputs and outputs of the economy and could do things like reduce inequality. They could transfer money around to giant infrastructure projects or to giant projects of social development or education, or moving money from rich to poor in a way that made people feel, whether they believed in that government or not, that these governments have extraordinary powers of transformation. These governments can truly develop their societies. And when they say they're going to do something, it's not hot air. They actually can do it. So Western states look back to that period with great nostalgia, but it was critically a period in which governments controlled labor. They were able to produce near full employment. That the circuit of sort of taxes, labor, and democracy, and the high industrial system of Western states, that was all a virtuous circle that kept these nation states in a particular kind of functional order. I think that the impact of a lot of tech firms over the coming years will be that states don't have any control over the levels of employment in their territories. And they will be highly dependent on private agencies of financing technology for whether their populations are employed or not. This will, A, further exaggerate to the populations that their governments actually can't do any of the things that they promise to do. But B, further produce this imbalance of power between private companies and states to the kind of detriment of the latter. And I think at that point, even if states are able to legislate about little bits of data or whatever, they are going to be profoundly weakened. And their populations are going to have to look to multiple sources, possibly, to satisfy their political needs. States are not going to be able to satisfy on their own the various sets of political, legal, and economic needs that populations have. And probably we return to a kind of pre-modern situation in which those needs are supplied by lots of different agencies, which might be private companies, which might be kind of public data systems, which might be states, and everything in between at the global and local levels as well.
Yeah, that's great. We have another piece in the issue written by Jack Henderson and I that touches on some of these topics of the sort of future of employment and future of sort of new sorts of networks of mutual support and non-state coordination and collaboration. So yeah, I will. We've only got a few more minutes. I'll turn to you, Paula. Should we any sort of calls to action that we should make before we wrap up?
Well, if you want to pitch us an idea, please reach out to us at combinations@radicalxchange.org. I think this is the main call to action, and we hope you like the essays. You share with us what you think about them, and help us spread the word about it. And I'd say maybe a final question where you can share a few brief remarks. We have to wrap up on the half hour. But one thing that you talk about in your essay, Rana, and that is obviously relevant for you, Christina, as an artist, is how do you see culture shaping these changes that you're discussing? So just curious to hear a few thoughts from each of you on that. Christina, you may go first, because I know you
Okay.
lead exactly on the half
Okay. Culture. I think to me, culture is relevant because of sorry, I'm still thinking about nation states and governance, but I think that cultural identity is so or like nation states have done so much to make us believe that cultural identity is tied to the nation state. And so I think that we basically probably need more you know, but now as technology sort of is breaking down those borders and is crafting new ways of conceiving of cultural identity, I think I'm curious to see how technology can sort of nurture this in an interesting and productive way, rather than in something that is like I don't know, sort of algorithmic radicalization. So yeah, I'm quite curious about how sorry, again, I'm sort of inverting your question, Paula, but I'm quite curious about how cultural identity will change given some of the technological apparatuses that we have these days.
Yeah, I'm also a novelist, and also sort of treat your question as a cultural producer at some level. I mean, I think that you know, nation states themselves were massive, massive cultural projects. I mean, so much of our art, music, storytelling, painting is about states, is about how they came to be, how we came to live in this particular place, our national heroes, all that sort of thing. And any profound political transformation also requires an outpouring of culture. I don't think political transformations happen because we've got this cool new technology or something. They happen much more euphorically. They happen because there is a deep need, and you know, the nation state fulfilled many of those needs, and people would die for them, sacrifice everything for them, write the most beautiful poetry and songs for them. I think a real political rebirth requires a cultural rebirth of that sort. But I think that cultural rebirth is already happening at some kind of low level of reorganization. I mean, if you look at the recent US elections, and I was in several countries while as we prepared for November 5th, it's really remarkable the extent to which territoriality is no longer part of most people's culture, so that the US election was everybody's election. And and many people felt quite resentful that it was US citizens who were deciding the outcome of election that impinged on their reality in extremely personal and violent ways. So I think in some ways, you know, in this moment of populism, we think of publics being sort of behind the sort of political need, but also the public is ahead of the political need of politics in many ways. And to some extent, we need a culture that actually matches our experience, a culture that can turn globalization from a sort of gangsterism of commerce and technology into a culture, a society, something that we're all excited about and have reasons to, you know, sacrifice ourselves for or believe in, and all those kinds of things. I think what has really disappeared from our world, both at the national level and the global level, is some kind of fervor, some sort of belief that there is something worth dying for, something that is so important and so beautiful that we will do anything to realize it.
Well, this is a wonderful note to wrap up on. Christina and Rana, thank you so much for being with us. This was a fascinating conversation, and we hope that for those of you that are watching, that you go read their essays. There's a lot more than what we discussed in this hour and a half, and we hope to continue the conversation. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Aaron, can we leave? I think that we do have to stay a little bit after the live stream stops, so that it's properly saved. Aaron, can you let us know?
Okay.
Well, while we're just hanging around, can I just say that this whole process of writing for you guys was really fun, because you came back with such brilliant challenges and edits. I really enjoyed the whole process and would love to stay involved with you individuals and your publication. And Christina, I loved your piece, and it was really fun to hear your remarks today. So I hope this can, be some sort of circle in some ways, and that we can collaborate on ideas and continue to be involved. Anyway, lots of fun. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, same for me. Yeah, totally. I'm still thinking about your piece, Rana. I didn't want to say this during the live stream because we were probably running out of time, but I feel like and maybe it's not really same, the main thing I got from this chat today was basically sort of this implication that, like, when it comes to technology, nation states just aren't powerful enough to do the kind of governance that Matt was trying to suggest. And I really liked, Rana, I think you really highlighted for me this sort of divergence of like technological power and of nation state power over the past few decades, or maybe longer than that. And that, I feel like it really illustrates or like sort of underlies a lot of the patterns that I've noticed. So I think to me, it feels like almost my conclusion after this talk today is that planet